So I'm going to ask you all kind of vocabulary words. What are your different kinds of sampling? If I said, what kind of sampling does every member of the population have the same chance of selection? Well, see, that would be random. If I said, okay, the population, I'm going to pick every 10th item in the population. Well, that would be systematic. If I said I'm going to pick groups instead of individuals, that would be cluster sampling. Okay, so I'm going to ask you lots of different kinds of vocabulary, discrete and continuous, all those things out of chapter 1. So make sure that you know those vocabulary things out of chapter 1. And I might ask you out of chapters 4 and 5, I might say something like, what are your 2 types of probability? Well, that would be empirical and theoretical. If I said, which one's based on experiments? Well, that would be empirical. If I said, basically, what you call 2 events that cannot happen at the same time, that would be mutually exclusive. Okay. I might say probability is always a number between blank and blank. That would be 0 and 1. I might ask, when something cannot happen, what's its probability? 0. If it's certain to happen, what's its probability? 1. So it may be true, false. It might be fill in the blank. It's not going to be matching. So make sure that you don't forget to look over the vocabulary and kind of the short answer kind of questions. Okay. I might ask you things about symbols. All right. Now by that, I mean this. Let's see. Okay. So there are 2 symbols for me. All right. Mu and X with a bar over it. All right, both of those are symbols for me, but mu comes from the population and X bar comes from a sample. Okay, there are 2 symbols for standard deviation. All right, they are a lowercase sigma, just kind of like a 0 with a little tag on it, and then an S. All right, this is the one that comes from a population, and S is a standard deviation that comes from a sample. So notice the Greek letters are always population symbols and the English letters are sample symbols. And that's a real big deal. So make sure you know what those 4 things are symbols, what they stand for. You're going to need to understand them to do the formulas. All right, and you're also going to need, you might be like a fill in the blank question as well. Okay, so do make sure that you're good to go on symbols and things. Okay, so chapter 1 is mostly vocabulary. Those videos are still out there. You have the book. So if you have any questions like, I can't figure out what kind of sampling it is, or I kept getting it wrong whether it was discrete data or continuous data, then if you email me, we can Zoom and maybe I can help you figure that out a little bit. Okay, so I think we're good to go there. Now, what happens next, all right, chapter 2 talks about frequency tables. Okay, so make sure you understand that in chapter 1, you have a lot of vocabulary. All right. And then you might have to identify things. Like I might ask you to identify the type of sampling. So I might give you an example, like a word problem, and ask you what kind of sampling is that? Okay. Can everybody see the board okay? Say yes or no.
Yes.
Okay. So I also might have you identify levels of measurement. All right, so I might ask you if something is nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio. Okay, so that's your kinds of measurements: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. All right, and again, that's on a video, but make sure you remember nominal is category only. That'll be something like gender, hometown, hair color. So it's a lot of times nominal is words, not always, but a lot of times. Ordinal, remember, means that you have an order, but the differences are unknown or meaningless. Like if I told you something is good, better, or best. Well, you know, better is above good, you know, but you don't know what's the difference between just good and better. It might be like, this is a 4-star movie versus a 3-star movie. You would know that 4-star movies are better, but you wouldn't know how much better, okay? The two that people get confused are interval and ratio. The differences between them is interval might have a 0 on the measuring scale, but you can go past it. In other words, you might have negative data, like temperatures, okay? Ratio, there's a 0 and you cannot go past it, like say weight. Like nobody's gonna weigh a negative pounds, okay? So types of sampling, levels of measurement, whether something is discrete data, you know, versus continuous data. So a lot of vocabulary, and like I said, things out of chapter 1, like identify. Okay, so that's the kind of questions you'd probably have out of chapter 1. All right, now, what about chapter 2? Okay, well, chapter 2, remember, that's a lot of things like frequency tables. Okay, so I might ask you to make a frequency table. And I might ask you to answer questions off of a frequency table. Okay. All right, let me get my book for a second. Okay. But sometimes I kind of pause so that, you know, you can kind of do a couple of things. Okay. Now, I'm going to do this first, and I'll show you some, and then the third thing are the different kinds of graphs. So like make one or read one, okay? Now, the kind of graph that you're supposed to know how to make, one is called a histogram. And when I say histogram, the 2 words I want to pop in your head are bar graph. All right, you got to be able to make a bar graph or a histogram. And remember, on the horizontal scale, on a bar graph, you have to use the boundaries, the class boundaries. And the way I remembered that was boundaries and bar both starting with a B, okay? Another kind of graph you got to be able to make is a frequency polygon. All right, now when I say frequency polygon, I want you to think line graph. Okay, so histogram is the bar graph and the frequency polygon is that line graph. But you don't use the boundaries to make the frequency polygon, you use the midpoints of the classes. So that's something students get confused sometimes, is when do I use the boundaries and when do I use the midpoints, okay? Well, I use the boundaries on the bar graph, on the histogram. I use the midpoints on the line graph, which is that frequency polygon. Then you got to be able to read or make a circle graph. Okay. Then you have like a stem and leaf plot, but I won't put one of those on the test. I think I did one of those, but you might have, there's one more kind of graph that you might have. And that one more kind of graph that you might have is not out of chapter 2, but it's basically, I think it's at the end of chapter 3, but I'm going to go ahead and write it. It's a box plot. So these are kind of the 4 kinds of graphs that might be on your midterm. A histogram, a frequency polygon, a circle graph, and then a box plot, okay? So the box plot does come out of chapter 3, I believe, okay? So that's kind of the main things you got to be able to do out of chapter 2. So for instance, okay, if you had a frequency table that looked like this, okay, maybe it was like 10 to 14 and 15 to 19 and 20 to 24, okay? And maybe this was like a 6 and a 3, and maybe this one is an 8. All right. I might ask you questions, like I might ask you, what is the class width? All right, now remember, you don't subtract horizontally, you subtract vertically. So you can find any two numbers that are under each other vertically, and that'll be your class width. So 20 minus 15 is 5, 24 minus 19 is 5, 19 minus 14 is 5. So the answer to this would be the class width of that table is 5. All right. I might ask you, what is the midpoint of a certain class? So if I said, what's the midpoint of the first class? Well, you would take this 10 and add it to this 14 and divide it by 2. So 10 plus 14 divided by 2 would be 24 divided by 2 would be 12. So that answer is 12. Okay. Now, let me warn you about something. Everybody likes partial credit, but you can't have it both ways. I'm going to give you credit for what's right on your paper, and I'm going to take off for what's wrong. So here's what I mean by that. If you were to say 10 plus 14 is 24, and then say divided by 2 is 12, I would have to count off for that. Equals does not mean here comes your next step. Equals means what's on the left side is equal to what's on the right side. And so this says that 10 plus 14 equals 12, and it doesn't. So do you see the difference between the way I wrote it here and the way I wrote it here? So don't just string steps together with equals unless they really do have the same mathematical value. Okay? So make sure you can find the midpoints. Now, the things that people get confused are this. If I say, what is the lower limit of the second class versus what is the lower boundary of the second class? So I don't want you to get limits confused with boundaries, because there's not much partial credit on that. Limits are the numbers that are just sitting there, okay? So my second class is either 15 or 14. Well, lower means smaller. It doesn't mean left, it means smaller, because the table could go from big down to small. So the answer to number 3, what's the lower limit of the second class, is just 15. So limits are just there for you to grab them. The upper limit would be 19, okay? Remember, boundaries are a little more trouble, okay? So remember what I told you in the video. If you want to find the boundaries, you take the end of class 1 and the beginning of class 2 and you subtract them, okay? So that means I would over here to the side say 15 minus 14 and get 1, all right? Then I would have to take that difference and I would have to divide it by 2. So when you take your calculator, 1 divided by 2 is going to give you 5/10. And that's the number that you subtract from the lower limits. So this number minus 5/10 is 9.5. 15 minus 5/10 is 14.5. 20 minus 5/10 is 19.5. Then you take this number and you add it to the upper limits. So 14.5, 19 and 5/10, 24 and 5/10. So those red numbers are my boundaries. So what's the lower boundary of the second class? Well, my boundaries are this 14 and 5/10 and this 19 and 5/10, and the smaller is the 14 and 5/10. So see, boundaries and limits aren't the same answer. So make sure you know whether it's asking you to find a boundary or a limit. So make sure you can find like boundaries and limits and midpoints and all those kinds of things if I give you a table. Okay? Now, The other thing you've got to be able to do is you got to be able to make me a table. Okay. So if I gave you something like just a list of data. All right. So if I gave you something like 14, 12, 27, 11, 36, 30, 20, 12, 15. And I said, make me a table with 3 classes. Right? And the first class must be something like 10 to 16. Well, if I tell you that the first class has to be 10 to 16, then the first class has to be 10 to 16. Well, if this stops with 16, then naturally common sense says the next one's got to start with 17. And as soon as you do that, you know the class width. So 17 minus 10 is 7. So now I keep adding 7 until everything fits. So this number plus 7 means this is going to go up to 23. And this number plus 7 means that one's 24. When I add 7 there, I get 30. And I go, can I quit? Well, no, because I don't have 36 fitting anywhere. So that's going to be 31, and that's going to be 37. So my biggest number fits. So now we'll just go count between 10 and 16. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers. And so then I would just fill the rest of the table in. Okay. Instead of doing that, I might say, you know, make me a table with just 3 classes. Except I wouldn't tell you how many classes, I'm sorry. I would just say make a table with the first class of 10 to 16, because there I think I needed 4. So I might tell you what the first class is, or I might say make a table with 3 classes. Now remember, if I do that, you've got to find the class width by saying the highest number minus the lowest number, which is what, 11? So that's going to give me what, 25? And then you would have to take that number and divide by your 3. All right, so if you took 25 and divided by 3, that's going to give you what, like 8 1/3, and then you got to round up to 9 to get your class width. So make sure that there's a couple of different ways on the video to make a table. So make sure you can make a table both ways. Okay. And then, like I said, make sure that you can do a frequency polygon, remember line graph, using those midpoints, and make sure you take those end points and drop them down to the horizontal. Make sure you can make a histogram. Remember, that's where you put the boundaries and you draw the bars up to a height that corresponds to their frequencies. Make sure that you can make a circle graph. Now, you're welcome to get a protractor to get the angle measures, but I've got to see the angle measures. If the angle measures aren't on your paper, like written, I'm not going to give you credit. You can't go, that looks about 37% of the circle. Okay, you can't do that. I've got to see what your angle measures are. And inside the circle, you would just put your class. And then from your scratch work, I'll get what that angle measure is. Okay. So if you don't remember how to do that, make sure you go back and look at it. And we'll talk about the box plot in a minute. So that's kind of chapter 2. All right. Then chapter 3 is the one that is all the different kinds of things. So the first thing you got to do is you got to be able to find measures of center. All right. Remember what those are. Those are mean, median, mode, and mid-range. And I'm so sorry they all start with M. It's really masochistic. Okay. So remember, for mean, you just add all the data up and divide by how many pieces you have. Okay. Remember, mode is the data that occurs most often. Now, you can have more than one mode, but it can't be every single number. So if they all occurred 2 times, or they all occurred 1 time, then you would write down no mode. Don't leave it blank or I'll assume you didn't know what to do. But it might be that 2 or 3 of them occur 6 times each. So it's not which data is repeated. It's the ones that occur most often. Okay. Then to get median, remember, you got to put the data in order and pick the one in the middle. But if you've got an even number of pieces of data, they're going to be 2 numbers in the middle. Just average those 2 numbers. And then remember, mid-range, you take the high and the low and you add them and divide by 2. Okay? So make sure that you can find the mean, the median, the mid-range, and the mode for like a list of numbers, you know, 12, 13, 10, 15, another 12. Okay? So if I put that data in order, 10, 12, 12, 13, and 15, all right, then if I grab the number in the middle, 12 would be my median, okay? My mode would also be 12 because 12 occurs more than the other pieces of data. Now for mid-range, I would take my low plus my high, and I would divide by 2. So if I got 25 divided by 2, I'd get 12 and a half for my mid-range. And then for mean, remember, I would take those numbers and I would add them all up. 10 plus 12 plus 12 plus 13 plus 15. I'd take that 62 and I would divide by 5. So my mean would be 12 and 4/10. Okay, so make sure that you can find all your different measures of center for a list of numbers. Okay, then make sure that you can find your measures of variation. All right, and your measures of variation are going to be range, standard deviation, and variance. Okay. Now, let me just warn you about things. Sometimes things sound almost the same. People get them mixed up. Remember when we did mid-range? Remember, mid-range was high plus low divided by 2. But range is just high minus low. So they're close enough to be dangerous. Both of them use high and low, but one time I add them, one time I subtract them, one time I divide by 2, and one time I don't. So I've got to be real careful. Am I finding mid-range or am I finding range? So my range up here would just be my high 15 minus my low 10 would be 5. Now, for standard deviation, I would just enter the data in the calculator in a list and then go use my calc button to get the standard deviation off of the calculator. But when you do, make sure that you grab Sx dot sigma x. Okay, now I hate this notation. This is a Texas Instruments notation. I wish they would just say S and sigma. That's what they should say. That's what you're going to write on your paper. Okay. But the calculator, when the programmer programmed the calculator, I think he was trying to remind you, this is the standard deviation from the numbers in the list, okay? But we're doing a sample, so we want to grab the S one, not the sigma one off the calculator. And then remember, to get variance, you just take your standard deviation from the calculator and you square it. You don't square root it, you square it. And I'm not going to double whammy you. So if you miss the standard deviation, then naturally you're going to miss variance. So if you told me the standard deviation was 10 and that wasn't right, I would expect you to take whatever you got here and square it. So I would count off for this one, but I wouldn't count off for that one because you did it correctly, but it was based on the wrong answer. Okay? So make sure you can find me your measures of variation. And then make sure you can find me your measures of relative standing. Okay? Measures of relative standing. So that's things like a z-score. And that formula is on your formula sheet. It's X minus X bar over S. So remember, every time the whole semester, when you see X in a formula, that X is your data. And then remember, that's the symbol for mean, and that's the symbol for standard deviation. The thing I want you to remember on z-scores is I want 2 decimal places. So if it came out to be something like 2.015 whatever, since this number is 5 or bigger, you would round it to 2.02. Okay, so I want 2 decimal places on z-score. So if they come out to be exactly 2, then you would tell me 2.00. Okay, so z-scores are rounded to the hundredths place. Okay, so make sure that you can do z-scores. Now, about a z-score, here's what your author says. He wants to know what usual data is. All right, usual is between 2 numbers. It's between the mean plus 2 times the standard deviation and the mean minus 2 times the standard deviation. Okay, so I think in the video, I told you that for IQ scores, the average IQ score is 100, and the standard deviation for IQ scores is 15. So what's considered to be a usual IQ score? Well, I would take my mean of 100, and I would say 2 times 15. Remember, order of operations, we multiply before we add. So 100 plus my 30 would be 130. If I took my 100 minus 2 times my standard deviation, I get a z-score of 70. So usual IQ scores would be somewhere between 70 and 130. So if I said somebody's IQ is 103, is that usual or unusual? You would say, well, that's usual. Unusual are numbers bigger than this or smaller than this. Some people like to just use the actual values, and some people like z-scores. So usual is from a z-score of, so usual has a z-score between 2.00 and a negative 2.00. So if your data has a z-score above 2, it's unusual. If your data has a z-score less than a negative 2, it's unusual. So some people like to do usual and unusual by z-scores. Okay. So that takes care of z-scores. And that's the other thing, make sure you understand that there's something called a normal distribution. Now, the whole second half of the class deals with a normal distribution, but you do need to have the percentages memorized, okay? So remember when the video talked about your kinds of measures of center, like your mean, your median, your mid-range, those are not usually exactly the same numbers. Well, on a normal curve, they are, okay? So if you have a normal distribution, you take your mean and you add 1 standard deviation, and you take your mean and you subtract 1 standard deviation, 68% of your data is going to be between those 2 numbers. All right, you can go back and look at that video again if you're getting confused. If you take your mean and you add 2 standard deviations, if you take your mean and you subtract 2 standard deviations, 95% of your data is between those 2 values. So that would be like our 70 to 130 on our IQ scores. All right. And between your mean plus 3 standard deviations and your mean minus 3 standard deviations is 99.7% of your data. Okay. So make sure that you understand that those 3 percentages. They're in your book and they're on the video. Okay. The other thing you've got to do besides z-scores, you've got to be able to do percentiles. So I might give you a list of numbers and I might say something like, what percentile is 13 in that list, or I might say, find piece of 25. Okay, so those are two different kinds of questions that I would expect you to be able to do with percentiles. Okay, and now remember, quartiles are just like percentiles. Okay, so in the video, remember I told you that quartile 1 is the same thing as piece of 25. And quartile 2 is the same thing as piece of 50. And quartile 3 is the same thing as the 75th percentile. And the way I used to remember it was pennies. 25 pennies in 1 quarter, 50 pennies in 2 quarters, 75 pennies in 3 quarters. Okay, so make sure, so if I ask you to find Q2, just say, oh, that's the same thing as piece of 50, and then do them the same way. So I show you in the videos how to do those kinds of questions. Okay, and then the last thing out of chapter 3 is, so I might ask you to find the mean. And again, it could be a list of numbers like this, or it could be from a frequency table. Now, if it tells you to find the mean of a frequency table, you have to use the formula on the formula sheet, on the front of the formula sheet. That's different. Same thing, I might ask you to find the standard deviation. And again, it might be from a list, so kind of A and B. It might be from a list of numbers, or it might be from, again, a frequency table. And these frequency table ones, you have to use the formula. You cannot just use the calculator. I won't take it on a frequency table. Okay. You can find me the standard deviation and the mean from the calculator using the calc button. Okay. And then, of course, if I ask for variance, you would just square the standard deviation. Okay. So that's kind of chapters 1, 2, and 3. Now, before I go any further, do this for me. Put your cameras back on for a second. Okay. Let me kind of move them over here. All right. And then unmute. All right. Does anybody have a particular question that you want to ask me before I kind of go into chapters 4 and 5? Does everybody kind of feel okay about chapters 1, 2, and 3?
Pretty much.
Okay, here's what I'm going to do. All right, I'm going to go into chapters 4 and 5. But let me tell you this. When I finish the Zoom, okay, it'll probably take us about another 25 minutes or so. When I finish going over chapters 4 and 5 real quick, just kind of telling you what kind of questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to do the same thing. But I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, okay, if you got a particular question, stay on Zoom. And if you don't, have a great night. Okay? So if you don't have any questions and you feel good about it, then you can get off. All right, and not just stay on and listen to other people. But if there's a particular problem you want me to work, or could you clarify this thing, then I'll be happy to do that. Okay? Does that sound okay to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Now let me warn you about this. Okay. For a lot of students, chapters 4 and 5 are the most challenging of the whole course. Okay. So I don't want you to think if chapters 4 and 5 are giving me some trouble, then I have no hope when I get to chapters like 6 and 7. That's not true. Okay. The reason that a lot of people struggle with chapters 4 and 5 is most people don't have any background in probability. You probably have found a mean average at some point. Okay. So you might not know what you called it, but I mean, you know, so there's some little bit of familiarity, but probability, not so much. Okay. Now, chapter 4 is already finished on web work. Chapter 5 closes Sunday. Okay. The reason I'm doing that is this. If you look on this week and next week, probably more next week, there are reviews on there. There's a review for chapters 1 through 3. And then there's a worksheet for probability. That's chapters 4 and 5. That's kind of what I call your study, like your study guide, I guess, for lack of a better word. If you can do that chapter 1 through 3 review, and you can do chapters 4 and 5, then that worksheet, you should be okay. All right. Now, probability is just the chance something's going to happen. Okay. So that's what probability is. You know, how sure are we this thing is going to happen? How sure are we sure it's not going to happen? So if something is impossible, that's a 0 probability. If something for sure must happen, that's a probability of 1. Okay. Everything in life is somewhere between never and always. Okay. So you should never get a probability answer that's smaller than 0 or bigger than 1. Like, don't even write it on your paper. Okay. Or sometimes a student will make a mistake and the probability comes out to be bigger than 1, and they know that's not right, but they can't find their mistake. Please write me a note. I know this ain't right. But I cannot find my mistake. That at least gets you 1 more point of partial credit. Okay. So you know that going in. Now, what I tell people is this about probability. If you do what I tell you, it gets to be a little bit easier. Okay. So the one thing I want you to do is anytime I ask you, what is a probability? I want you on your scratch work to do this. On your scratch work, I want you to put a P and what I'm telling you to find the probability of. All right. So if I'm telling you when you're flipping a coin, what's the probability that you get heads? Then I need to see a P and I need to see heads. If you don't have that, I'm not going to give you any partial credit. Because what's in the parentheses goes on top. And the total goes on the bottom. So I'm thinking, when I flip a coin, what are all the things I can get? I either get what? Heads or what? Tails. Yeah. That's how many things?
2.
So my total goes on the bottom. Of those 2 things, how many are heads? Only what?
1.
So heads can't go, one can't go to the bottom because it's got to go to the top. Okay? So with probability, I'm going to ask you, on probability, here's what I always tell people. All right, so I'm going to kind of, y'all can leave your cameras on. I think I can do this to make it, yeah, you can leave your cameras on. And you're, now, I'm just going to kind of put chapters 4 and 5 together, okay? Now, one of the questions I might ask you is this. I might ask you to find a probability. Okay, find a probability. Now, if I ask you to find a probability, there are 3 possibilities. It's either one thing, one time. Okay, or it is a connector word. And remember, our connector words are and, or, and given that. Or it's a binomial probability. Now, this is chapter 5, and this is chapter 4. So if you haven't really done much with chapter 5, then you're not going to understand about binomial. Okay? Now, the lovely thing about binomial is the calculator does all the work. Okay? So a lot of times, if it's not one thing one time, and I don't see a connector word, I'll jump down and see if it's binomial. Because I'd rather do binomial than a connector word. Okay? Now, what do I mean about one thing one time? Okay? Well, that's what I meant, like, if I've got a deck of cards, okay? So, again, I'm recording this so that you can, if you want to see the recording, I'll send all of you a link to it, okay? And then you can freeze it and kind of take notes if you didn't have time to copy something down. Okay. So if it's one thing one time, that would be something like this. Example. you pick one card from a deck. What is the probability you get a queen? Well, see, when it says, what is the probability? The first thing I start doing is put a P down and then what I'm looking for. So when I read that problem, it wants me, what's the probability you get a queen? So see, I'm going to have queen in parentheses. Now, the way that you word it, the way that I word it might be different. You might say, get a queen from a deck, draw a queen. I don't care. I've just got to see queen somewhere. Okay. So remember what I said on the bottom is your total. So when you're picking cards, what's your total? Well, there are 52 things in a deck of cards.
Yeah, 52 cards.
How many of those are queens?
4?
Yeah.
4 queens.
Because I got a queen of hearts, a queen of diamonds, a queen of club, and a queen of spades. Okay. Now, 2 ways to leave your answer. If you put your answer like this, I'm going to count it wrong. Okay. You've either got to give me a fraction reduced to simplest form, which most people don't like. That's 1/13. I would take that. Most people just give me an approximate decimal. So they would take their calculator and do 4 divided by 13. Now, if you're going to do decimals, I want at least 3 decimal places. Okay? Now, what you cannot round to 0 and you cannot round to 1. So if the answer came out to be something like 0.00000034, then you're going to have to go more than 3 places. Does that make sense? So don't ever round to 0 and don't ever round to 1. So if it was 0.999993, well, let's make it, then I'm going to, 34, then I'm going to have to go all the way out to there. Or if this was an 8, I could put 0.999994. Okay, that's good. Okay, so round it at least 3 or 4 decimal places, but unless you end up rounding to, don't round to 0 or 1. So when I do this, here's what's on my machine. 3076923077. So I could round 0.308. Okay, and then that means approximately equal to. So that warns somebody that I rounded, or 0.3077. Okay, now if you want to write it all out, that's fine. If you're scared I'm not going to round it correctly, then just write everything in the calculator. Just write it all the way out.
I did it on my calculator and it gave me like 0.
Oh, I'm sorry. I typed in the wrong thing, Maddie. Thank you. That would be ridiculous. There's not a 30% chance you're going to get a queen. Okay. 4 divided by 52 would be 0.077. Does that sound better?
Yes. Okay. I was like,
yeah, it's like what? Thank you, Maddie. Okay. Oops. All right. So show me as much scratch work. So for instance, if I had this written and then mistyped it on my machine like I did, I'd get more partial credit than if you just went from here to there. So showing me the kind of the in-between part is really important for partial credit. Okay. Now remember, if it's not one thing one time, there are formulas for or and on your formula sheet. Okay. So connector word. All right. So if I said something like, what's the probability that you get a red card or a queen? Well, see, or, and you're picking one card. All right. Well, that's one thing one time, but there's a connector word. So there's an or formula on your formula sheet. And that or formula says it's the probability of just the first one plus the probability of just the second one minus the probability that they both happen at the same time. So this means at the same time. Okay, and the way it's written in the formula sheet is the probability of A or B is the probability of A plus the probability of B minus the probability of A and B. So my A is the red and my B is the queen. So this is like 3 separate problems. So I'm doing the probability of red. So remember, my total goes on the bottom and this goes on top. So remember, half the cards are red and half the cards are black. So if I half that 52, I'm going to get 26. So 26, there are 26 red cards out of the 52. Then like a separate problem, what's the chance you get a queen? Remember, the total goes on the bottom. How many are queens? We said 4. And then minus, well, how many are reds and queens at the same time? Well, let's see, the queen of hearts is red and a queen, and the queen of diamonds is red and a queen, so that would be 2. Everybody okay? And then I would finish that up and get like 28 out of 52, and then I would just divide it and get a decimal on the calculator. All right? Now, what if I had said red or a spade? Well, if I said red or a spade, this would be red and spade. None of the cards are red and spades at the same time. Well, I would be subtracting a 0. That's what mutually exclusive means. That can't happen at the same time. So you're not going to freak out if that's a 0 out there. So if you have overlap, subtract it. If you don't have overlap, then you don't subtract anything. Okay? Now, when it's and, make sure that you know when it's and that you multiply. So if I say, okay, you're going to pick 2 cards, what's the probability that it is red and a spade? Now, I want to make sure we're clear. In the video, it tells you this, but I want to reiterate. Before you go grab that and formula, ask yourself, is it possible? Because if the answer is no, your answer is 0. If the answer is yes, then grab the formula. Now, what do I mean by that? What if I told you to pick 1 card? If you pick 1 card, can it be a red and a spade? No. So if something's not possible, what would the answer to this be?
0.
Finish, no work. Okay. Now, if I go back to pick 2 cards, now ask yourself,
is it possible?
Is it possible to get a red card the first time and a spade the second time? What's the answer?
Yes.
Yeah, then grab the formula. And order matters. They want this to happen first and this to happen second. So that'd be the probability of the first thing times the probability of the second thing. But the way I'm going to phrase it on your test, I'm going to say with replacement, or I'm going to say without replacement. With replacement means you would pick the first card, write down what you got, and then put it back before you picked again. Without replacement means once you pick it, it's gone. Okay? So if I were doing this without replacement, well, my chance of getting red, my total is 52. Of those, there are 26. So remember what it says in the video, you've got to assume this has happened. So do we understand that I have picked 1 card and I'm assuming it's what?
Good.
It's red. Yeah. So I'm keeping it. So when I go back in, what's my total?
51.
51. Of those, I need, how many are spades? Well, 13. The red card's not a spade. Does that make sense? So you got to know what you kept. Now, what if I had said with replacement? Well, if I said with replacement, this wouldn't be 51. This would still be what?
52.
52. Okay, so with replacement and without, so make sure you understand. Now, what if I had said pick 2 cards without replacement, and I said something like, what's the probability that they're both red? Well, see, I don't see a connector word, but it's kind of hidden. What's the only way they're both red? The first one's red, what?
And the second one.
And the second one have to be red. They're not going to say, what's the a chance you get red and red. We don't talk like that.
Right.
So sometimes you do have to reason it out. So it'd be the probability of red times the probability of red. Well, see, this would be 26 out of 52, but I'm assuming this card I'm keeping is what color?
Red.
Red. So when I go back in, there are 51 cards. How many are red? 25, because I kept one. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
But if it said with replacement, both of these would be 26 out of 52. Okay? Now, the other connector word is given that. And what I tell you on the video is, with given that, instead of using a formula, I use common sense. What's the probability that you're going to have a spade given that the card is black? Okay, so probability of a spade, and the symbol for given that's that bar. Okay, so if it's given that, now think about it. What if I just said, what's the probability something's a spade? Well, if all I said was just a spade, do we understand that it would be 13 out of 52? Because that's my spades and that's my total. But if I say, given that it's black, I'm guaranteeing you that it's black. So the thing to the right of the bars is certain. So that shrinks your total. So if I know the card is black, that shrinks it down to not 52, but 26. Of those 26 cards, how many are spades? What?
13.
13. So that's not going to be the same answer. Now, what if I said, what's the probability that you have a king? Well, if I know it's black, there are 26. Now, but I've got to put, I know there are 4 kings in a deck, but these have to come out of that. So if I know the card is black, how many kings are possible now? Only how many?
2.
2. So given that shrinks your total. So if you're going to use common sense, just make sure that these have to come out of that reduced total. So that's your 3 connector words. Okay. And then binomial is a formula on the machine. All right. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it. But when it's binomial, right, there can only be 2 categories. That's what bi means. Well, either you live or you die, you pass or you fail, boy or girl. We're not going to get into a spectrum there. Right, wrong. I can even say when I'm rolling a die, I know there's 6 things, but I might say either I roll a 2 or I don't. So I might go just lump some things together. But for you to say a problem's binomial, there can only be 2 categories. But here's the kicker. The probability can't change in the middle of the problem. So that's what the other condition is same probabilities throughout. So if I say something like there are 20 questions on a test, and you've got A, B, C, D choices, and I say, what's the probability that you get exactly 4 right? And you're just guessing. Well, see, that's not one thing one time. I don't see a connector word. And so I think, well, maybe it's a binomial problem. Well, let's see. If I'm guessing, I need to get the question right or what?
Wrong.
Wrong. So those are my categories, right and wrong. Okay. Well, if I'm just guessing, what's my chance of getting any question right?
4.
There are 4 possibilities. How many are right?
It's 25%.
That makes sense. So 1 out of 4 or 0.25. So my chance of getting question 1 is 1 out of 4. My chance of getting question 11 is 1 out of 4. My chance of getting question 19 is 1 out of 4. So for the whole thing, my probability of it being that category doesn't change. Then I could do it binomially. But now go back a minute ago to me not putting those cards back. See, what's the chance they're both red? What's the chance I get 2 red cards? Well, if I'm not putting the red card back, then my chance of getting a red card changes the second pick from the first pick. So I can't do that problem binomial. Okay? So if it's binomial, you make sure that you write down N, X, P, and Q every time you're working the problem, because that's going to help you when you do that. N is your total. X is what's in the number in the parentheses with the modifiers. So here my N would be 20. There are 20 questions total. My X would be 4. Now, P and Q are probabilities. And they're 2 because they're 2 categories. P is always the category in the parentheses. So P would be my chance of getting it what?
Right.
Right. And we already said that was 1 out of 4, which is 0.25. Okay. And then to get Q, you just say 1 minus P. So 1 minus 0.25 would be 0.75. And then you go to that binomial key on your calculator. The video tells you how to do that if you haven't gotten there yet. Talk about that in a minute. Okay? We good?
Q is always the complement of...
Yes. It's the category that's not in the parentheses. So the easiest way is to find P first. And then just say Q is 1 minus that. But now, make sure that you pay attention, because I might say, what's the chance you get exactly 4 wrong? So I might flip the category on. Okay? So make sure, that's why one of the reasons I want you to put a P and what you're looking for in the parentheses. Remember, we did that back at the very beginning because I knew this was coming. Okay? So whichever category is in the parentheses, it has to go with your P. So I might say something like 10% of people are right-handed. And then I might say, what's probably exactly 4 are left-handed? And you're like, well, it's not 10%. I mean, if it's left-handed, well, if 10% are left-handed, what percent would be right-handed?
90.
90. So right. Make sure that your P is the category in that parenthesis, not necessarily what's written in the problem. Okay? Now, make sure, here's the reason I also said modifiers. What if instead I said at most 4? Now, at most doesn't mean more than. If the most the bridge can handle is 1,000 pounds, that doesn't mean more than 1,000. That means that's your top, right? Mm-hmm. So do we understand if I said at most 4, what would X be? It wouldn't just be 4. What else would it be?
1, 2, 3.
Like 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. But we have something else. What? What about 0?
Oh, yeah.
0. None of them. You see what I'm saying? So now I would have to put 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Okay. So what if it said at least 4? Well, at least 4 doesn't mean less than 4. That's your low point. So it means 4 or what?
More.
Or more. So then my X would have been 4 or 5 or 6 all the way to or 20. Does that make sense to everybody? Mm-hmm. So now, if you haven't watched the videos about binomial yet, what I'm going to say next is going to make a whole lot of sense, but just bear with me. It tells you where to go on the calculator to find the binomial distribution, but there are 2 binomial keys. There's a binomial PDF key, and there is a binomial CDF key. You want to make sure you're using the right key. Okay. All right. You use the P one when there is one number next to X. Okay? You use the C one when there's a list of numbers next to X. That starts with 0. Like a minute ago, remember we had N was 20. The first time we said X was 4, P was 0.25, and Q was 0.75. When it was the probability that exactly 4 are right. Remember that one? Then I would use the binomial PDF key because next to X, there's only one number. But if it says, what's the probability that at most 4 are right? Well, then, remember my N was 20, my X was 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. My P would be 0.25, my Q would be 0.75. Well, see, that's more, a list is just more than one number. But the list has to start with 0. This list starts with 0, so I would use the C key. Now, remember where I said at least 4. Okay, at least 4 was a list, but it didn't start with 0. Well, then I'm stuck. Now, the video will tell you, I'm not going to take time to go over it now, but the video will tell you what to do when you do that. You can do 1 minus the probability of the complement. That's what I would do, because that list will start with 0. Or you could do this P key for like 4 and get that answer and save it, and then do the P key for 5 and get that answer and save it, and do it like all the way to 20 and then add them up. But just make sure you know the P keys when you have one number, the C key is when you have a list that starts with 0, and the video will tell you what to do if you don't have either one of those. Okay? And then make sure that you can find the mean, the standard deviation, and the variance for a binomial word problem. And again, that formula is on your sheet. Okay? All right. So turn your cameras are back on, so I'm gonna move you here. All right, so back to chapters 4 and 5. All right, make sure you write this down there. All right, so I might ask you to find the probability, and we went over a bunch of ways to do that. That's one thing I might ask you to do. I might ask you to find a total. All right, if I ask you to find a total, that's either going to be that counting principle, permutations, or combinations. And again, there's a video for that. All right. This is the only one where order does not matter. And this is a key on your calculator. So combinations, it tells you on the video how to do it on your calculator. Okay. If order does matter, then I would use the counting principle. All right. And again, they tell you how to do that in the video. It's a formula. Okay. You don't really ever have to use permutations. You can use just combinations and the counting principle if I tell you to find a total. Okay. Let's see what else it might ask you to do. All right, find a probability, find a total. Let's see. Oh, odds in favor and odds against. Find the odds. And it might be for an event or against an event. And again, odds can be bigger than 1 because with odds, you have a probability on top of another probability. Okay. and it has to have 2 numbers. So if the odds come out to be 2 to 1, don't just put 2. Leave it 2 to 1. Okay. And remember, 4, the chance something does happen is on top of the chance something does not happen. So if it's odds for an event, you have the probability that the event occurs over the probability that the event does not occur. Okay. And then this one is the opposite. The not's on the top and the does is on the bottom. Okay. And then make sure that you can find the mean, standard deviation, and variance of a binomial problem. Okay. So if I ask you to find standard deviation, mean, or variance, it's either got to be a list of numbers, that's chapter 3, or it's got to be a frequency table. All right, tells you how to do that in chapter 3, or it's got to be a binomial problem. Okay, so I don't think there's any way to get that confused. Make sure that you can find the mean of a list of numbers, the mean of a frequency table, that's a formula on the sheet, or the mean of a binomial probability word problem. Okay. All right, so that's kind of how chapters 4 and 5 go. And I did put the answers to that review also on Canvas as well. Okay. All right, does anybody have a question for me?
Yes.
Okay.
So I was wondering, is the test going to be like in some sort of chapter format order, or is it going to be like randomized?
It's more randomized. I don't particularly go, here's chapter 1, here's chapter 2, here's chapter 3, and here's chapter 4. Mostly it's how it fits on the page. Does that make sense? Like, I've got a little space, I can move this one up. I mean, they're kind of grouped together, sort of, but not necessarily on purpose.
Okay.
Okay. I will tell you this also. They're worded way more like the problems in the book, not the web work problems. Okay. Maddie, you've had me before. Unmute a second. Would you say that normally the homework out of the book kind of matches my tests?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. You got any advice for them?
I learned the hard way because I got behind on my homework and then I didn't do it. And then on my test, I didn't really do good. But then when I started doing the homework and like from the book, if you just practice it and you study it, you'll do good. Don't make the mistake that I made.
Yeah. We all learn the hard way. You know what I'm saying? The advantage that you do have here that they don't have in class is I do let you bring the formula sheet with anything written on the back you want to. Okay. So what I would do is like, you know, where do I go on binomial? You know, binomial, what do I do? Or you know, when the list doesn't start with 0, what do I do? You know what I'm saying? Some people kind of put an outline of the different kinds of test questions. Okay. So that's kind of what I do. What I would do if it were me, I'll be honest with you, I would, by this weekend, you know, by as soon as I can get it done, I finished chapter 5. Like if you really finish chapter 5, like Sunday, you're behind. Okay. Then I would study like I'm studying for the test. Then I would go use those reviews as a test. Okay. Because then you can see where you forgot. Okay. Because you have the answer, so you can check your own test. Okay. So I wouldn't necessarily look it up first. I would try to do it without looking because I've studied. Okay. Then when you use the reviews kind of as a test, then you know, oh my gosh, I thought I understood given that, but I missed it. I need to go study that some more. So that needs to happen more like Sunday. Does that make sense? That way you got Monday, Tuesday to clean up. Okay. My husband's a pastor, so Sundays, sometimes I'm got some free time. Sometimes I don't. So like this weekend, I'm going to be much more available Saturday than I am Sunday. Okay. But I will make sure that I'm available some Sunday, and I'll make sure that you can pretty much, I will Zoom with you almost anytime on Monday or Tuesday. Okay. So that, you know, just because sometimes that's just the way it pans out. Now, the test is scheduled for 6 o'clock next Wednesday night, so a week from tonight. Is anybody coming from out of town, though, that needs it earlier in the day? Is 6 o'clock going to work okay? I mean, somebody, but Devin's not on here. He's in Memphis, you know, but he's not on here, so we'll see. But so, is everybody good for 6 o'clock next Wednesday night? We good? Okay, anybody else got a question?
I have one question.
Okay,
I know
Alexia.
you want us to bring our student ID. Would a driver's license be fine? Because I don't have a student ID.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
As long as it's got a picture on it, I'm okay.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else got a question?
It's not about like what is about the test, but it's not like a chapter thing.
Okay.
Since I only see you twice, I have a letter for like accommodations for like extra time. Do you need a picture
just
of
bring
that?
it with you.
Okay.
Just bring it with you. That'll be fine. Okay.
Well,
Anybody else got a question? Go ahead, Maddie. Did you have another one?
No, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. All right. Anybody else got a question? Okay. So what I need you to do then is please study. Okay. All right.
I only got one question.
Okay, Johnny.
Can we still email you if we sit here trying to figure out a problem?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm happy to Zoom with you. Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Absolutely. But let me tell you what's a little bit, but this is the reason I say use those review sheets as a test. Sometimes people think, oh, I did fine on the online homework. But you have unlimited attempts at the online homework. You don't have unlimited attempt, and you have your book. Do you see what I'm saying? And the videos. You don't have that
And
when
I
you're
get
taking the
that.
test.
I'm just
So
waiting
it's a
on my
little
power to
misleading.
come on.
Do what, Johnny?
I'm just waiting on my power.
Oh, bless your heart. I'm so sorry. So sorry. So I just don't want y'all to get a false sense of I've got this, because after 24 attempts, I got that question right. Does that make sense? So, you know, you have to study. Okay.
Because you seriously showed me that in one of those reviews that I picked up. I was like, okay, let me try and do it on my own. Don't use a calculator. Just try and do it on your own. And I came up so wrong.
Right. And that's what I'm saying. And so you need to figure out, you have to have time to figure out there's a difference between being familiar with material and mastering it. Okay. Familiar's dangerous. Familiar means you can watch me do it and it makes sense.
And it mastery does, because means, you make so much sense.
Right, mastery means you can do it by yourself without your book, notes, or video, or me, and get it right. That's different. Okay. So to do well on the test, you have to have mastered it. And that takes time. And the problem with summer school is it's so fast. And if you get behind, you're just nailed. Okay. So what I need you to do is, like I said, try as soon as you can to get through with chapter 5 on that web work, and then start reviewing, and then do those review sheets as a test. And you can do 2 tests. Like I'm going to do one just with chapters 1 through 3, and then take that test. And then, I'm going to do 4 and 5 and then take that test. That's great. That's probably better. Okay. If you have trouble, email me, okay? Just don't wait till like Wednesday morning or like Tuesday at 9:30 that night. Like, I'm old, you know what I'm saying? Like, I ain't checking my email at 9:30.
Well, guess what? I'm old too, and hopefully I'll have power back by then.
I hope you will. I hope you will. If not, you know, I've spent so much of my time at like McDonald's with their free Wi-Fi, you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm just like all over.
At this point, I'm ready to walk up to MC.
That's what you can go to the library. It's open and we got Wi-Fi. So a girl or man's got to do what we got to do. Okay.
Yeah, we do.
Bring that sheet with anything written on the back you want to. Just don't write on the front. Bring a picture ID, bring your calculator, make sure it's got good batteries in it. It's a bad feeling when it dies in the middle of the test. Okay.
Wait. I got one question. Can you see my phone?
Wait a minute, Johnny, just a second. If you don't have a question, you're free to go.
No,
okay.
Can you see this phone? This
yes.
Calculator?
Yeah, hold it up a little bit. It looks like it. Yeah, it looks like it. Does it say TI-83 or TI-84 on it at the top?
No,
right?
It just says scientific calculator.
Okay.
School smart.
Do this for me. I can't really see it very well.
Okay.
So snap a picture of it and send it to me on an email so I can look at it better. Because it's got to either be a TI-83 or a TI-84. Now it won't, because the steps won't be the same. Okay?
Okay.
So if it's not that, then what's on the video is not going to make any sense to you.
No, it doesn't. Because I can hardly see
it won't be the same. So it's either got to be a TI-82 or TI-83 or a TI-84.
Okay.
And somebody's got one.
The oldest classmate in the world.
I think I have an extra either TI-83 or TI-84 if you need it.
Okay, sweetheart, but I think I got 2 of them laying around here.
Okay. Well, but get it before then, because you've got to have practiced with that calculator.
Yeah, I know.
So, right. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just making sure. All right. Anybody else got a clarification or a question? Okay, then do what you did. In other words, if you've got a question, you can snap me a picture and attach an email. I find your mistake, I'll work it, send it back, or Zoom. Sometimes a 10-minute Zoom is quicker. Just whatever works for you. Okay? All right, I will see y'all a week from tonight at 6 o'clock, and I'm going to send you a reminder. You're going to go to MCC 102. Okay, so the building is MCC, and you're going to go to room 102, but I'll send you a reminder. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Y'all have a good night. And if you want the video, just send me a thing and I'll send you a link.
Yeah, please send me the link.
Okay, I'll do that.
Y'all have a good night. Look, right, I need it more than them, so send it to me.
I'm with you too, Johnny.
Okay, I need it too. Okay, gotcha. All right, I'll send it to everybody. How about that? Okay.
Good deal.
Good. All right, if you need me, make sure you let me know.
All right.
Okay, bye.
Have fun tonight, guys.